In the dim hush of an Appalachian autumn, where the mist clung to the pines like forgotten sins, the year 1906 unfolded its secrets in the remote hollow of Blackthorn Ridge. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the wind whispered through the branches as if carrying tales from graves long overgrown. Eleanor Voss, a bride of unearthly beauty, had come from the shadowed valleys beyond the ridge, her eyes holding the depth of midnight pools that reflected no light. She married Elias Crow in a ceremony sparse as the mountain folk themselves, under a sky bruised with impending storm. The cabin they shared stood alone at the wood's edge, its timbers creaking like bones settling in the cold. That first night, as the fire died to embers and darkness swallowed the room, Elias felt her touch, a caress that promised ecstasy yet stirred a primal fear, as if her fingers traced not just his skin but the fragile veil between desire and damnation. Faint murmurs arose from the corners, voices too low to discern, echoing like echoes from a dream half-remembered. Little did he know, those whispers were harbingers of a terror rooted in the soil of those ancient hills, practices passed down through bloodlines twisted by isolation and something far older, lurking in the impenetrable gloom of the woods in the fading light of a crisp October day in 1906. The tiny settlement of Blackthorn Ridge stirred with an uncommon restlessness. Nestled deep in the folds of the southern Appalachians, where the mountains rose like ancient guardians and the valleys swallowed sound itself, the village consisted of little more than a scatter of weathered cabins, a blacksmith's shed, and a steepled meeting house that doubled as church and courtroom. Folks here lived close to the bone, bound by blood and hardship, their days measured by the rhythm of coal oil lamps and the distant howl of panthers in the laurel thickets. Word had traveled along the rutted trails weeks earlier that Elias Crow, a steady, quiet man in his late 20s who worked a small corn patch and ran a still in a hidden cove, was to take a bride. Elias kept mostly to himself since his parents passed in the fever of '02, and the prospect of him marrying stirred curiosity sharp as pine needles. But when the bride finally arrived, the curiosity curdled into something quieter, more uneasy. She came on foot, leading a single mule laden with a trunk and a few burlap sacks, emerging from the trace that wound down from the higher hollows where few outsiders ever ventured. Her name was Eleanor Voss, and she carried herself with a stillness that made the mountain air feel heavier. Tall and slender, with raven hair pinned beneath a plain bonnet, her skin held the pale luminescence of someone who had spent more time in shadow than sunlight. Her eyes, dark as wet slate, seemed to drink in every detail of the ridge without ever quite meeting another's gaze directly. She spoke softly, with a cadence that hinted at valleys even more remote than Blackthorn, places where old families clung to older ways. The women of the ridge noted the fine weave of her dress, faded but once costly, and the absence of any kin accompanying her. The men noticed how she moved through the settlement as if listening to something just beyond hearing, pausing now and then to tilt her head toward the dense wall of rhododendron and hemlock that pressed against the cabins. Children trailed her at a distance, half fascinated, half afraid, until she turned and fixed them with that unreadable stare, sending them scattering like quail. Whispers followed in her wake. Some said the Voss name carried weight in the deeper coves, tied to families who had never fully bent the knee to preachers or lawmen. Others recalled fragments of older talk tales of women in those isolated branches who knew remedies that worked too well, or who walked the ridges at night speaking to things that answered back. No one spoke such thoughts aloud, not yet, but the air grew thick with them as Eleanor settled into Elias's cabin at the very edge of the clearing, where the forest leaned in close enough to touch the eaves. By the time the sparse wedding gathering assembled a week later, the ridge had wrapped itself in a hush that felt less like celebration than anticipation of something inevitable, as though the mountains themselves were waiting to see what this pale bride from the shadowed hollows would bring with her into the heart of Blackthorn. The wedding feast had been modest, just a few neighbors gathered in the clearing with cornbread, sourwood honey, and jars of Elias's clear liquor passed hand to hand. Beneath a sky heavy with low clouds. When the last fiddle note faded and the guests drifted back to their own cabins, Elias and Eleanor stepped over the threshold of the small log house he had scrubbed and swept for days in quiet preparation. A single tallow candle burned on the mantel, throwing long shadows across the puncheon floor, and the fire in the stone hearth had settled into a bed of glowing coals that painted the walls in shifting amber. Eleanor moved with the same deliberate grace the ridge folk had watched for days, unfastening her bonnet and letting her dark hair fall loose like spilled ink. She smiled at Elias, a slow curve of lips that held neither shyness nor boldness, only certainty. He felt the pull of her then, stronger than anything the mountain stills could brew, and he crossed the room to take her in his arms. Her skin was cool beneath the worn linen of her dress, cool as creek water in deep shade, and when she pressed against him he caught the faint scent of earth and something greener, wilder, like crushed ginseng root or the inside of a hollow log. They came together on the narrow rope bed with a hunger sharpened by weeks of restraint. Her hands guided his with a knowledge that startled him, tracing paths across his body as though she had mapped them long before this night. Pleasure rose swift and fierce, carrying him like a spring flood down the hollow, yet threaded through it was a current of unease he could not name. Her breath against his throat was steady, almost measured, and her eyes, even in the dim flicker of firelight, remained open, watching him with that same depthless gaze. In the hush between heartbeats he thought he heard a murmur, soft as wind through dead leaves, rising from the corners of the room where the shadows pooled thickest. The sounds grew as the night deepened, low, overlapping whispers that seemed to come from no throat at all. They brushed against his ears like moth wings, words too faint to grasp yet heavy with intent. Eleanor's movements never faltered, if anything, they became more deliberate, drawing him deeper into the tide of sensation until the boundary between ecstasy and dread thinned to nothing. Each time he neared the edge of release, the voices swelled just enough to tug at his attention, pulling him back from surrender. He told himself it was the wind finding cracks in the chinking, or the creek far below talking to itself over stones, but the murmurs carried a rhythm that matched the cadence of her touch, as though something unseen approved, encouraged, fed. Sweat cooled on his skin while heat still burned where her body met his, and the candle guttered lower, stretching shadows into shapes that almost moved on their own. Eleanor leaned close, her lips brushing his ear, and for a moment he thought she would speak his name. Instead, the whispers answered for her, closer now, curling around them both like smoke from greenwood. As the nights lengthened into November, the cabin at the edge of Blackthorn Ridge grew quieter by day and stranger by night. Elias rose before dawn to tend the stock and the still, but he returned earlier each evening, drawn by a restlessness he could not name. Eleanor kept to the house, moving through her tasks with the same unhurried grace, her hands busy with needle or kettle yet never quite seeming occupied. She spoke little, and when she did her voice carried that soft, measured cadence that made the words feel older than the speaker. One evening, after a hard frost silvered the clearing, Elias came in to find the fire already laid and burning low. Eleanor sat on the hearthrug, knees drawn up beneath her skirt, staring into the flames as though reading script in the shifting coals. Spread around her were small objects he had never seen before, a bundle of dried herbs bound with red thread, a flat stone etched with faint circles and lines, a narrow bone whistle no longer than a finger, and a leather pouch that gave off a faint, sharp scent when she loosened its drawstring. She did not startle when his shadow fell across her, instead she lifted her gaze and smiled that slow, certain smile, then gathered the items back into the pouch with deliberate care. Later, when they lay together in the rope bed, the rituals began in earnest. She would light a single candle stub and place it on the floorboards at the foot of the bed, far enough that its flame barely reached their faces. Then she drew the pouch from beneath the pillow and scattered pinches of its contents, dark crumbs that might have been leaf or bark, across the quilt in patterns that shifted each night. Her touch grew more commanding, guiding his hands to places on her body marked with faint charcoal sigils that appeared and vanished between one dusk and the next. The coolness of her skin deepened until it felt like river stone in winter, yet the heat between them flared hotter, almost feverish. The whispers returned, stronger now, threading through the creak of the bed ropes and the pop of burning pine. They rose from the scattered herbs, or perhaps from the etched stone she sometimes pressed against his chest, its chill biting through flesh to bone. Words formed at the edge of hearing, old words, twisted by accents no preacher on the ridge had ever used, urging, coaxing, tasting. Eleanor's eyes stayed open, reflecting the candle's flame like twin black mirrors, and her breath came in rhythm with the murmurs, as though she drew them in and breathed them out again. Some nights she traced the bone whistle along his spine, never quite blowing it yet producing faint, reedy notes that seemed to come from inside his own skull. Other nights she pressed the leather pouch between their joined bodies, its contents warming until the sharp scent filled the room like crushed laurel after rain. Each time pleasure crested, the voices surged, layering over one another in approval or hunger, and Elias felt the boundaries of his own skin grow uncertain, as though something else moved within the cabin's walls, watching through the gaps in the logs. Waiting in the dense press of the forest just beyond the door. By mid-December the ridges lay under a thin, hard snow that muffled every footfall and turned the forest into a wall of white and shadow. Elias had begun to sleep poorly, waking with the taste of iron in his mouth and the echoes of voices still curling in his ears. He moved through his days like a man underwater, chores half finished, the still untended. Folks on the ridge noticed the change in him, the hollows beneath his eyes, the way he flinched at sudden sounds, and they kept their distance, murmuring among themselves that marriage could wear a man down quicker than moonshine or coal dust. Old Granny Lavinia Pike, the eldest soul left in Blackthorn, watched him closest. She lived alone in a cabin half fallen into the hillside, its chimney always smoking with herbs that kept rheumatism and worse things at bay. Folks came to her still for poultices and prophesies, though the new circuit preacher called her ways heathen. One grey afternoon, as Elias passed her place hauling a sack of corn to the millstone, she called him in with a voice like dry leaves scraping tin. Inside, the air hung thick with wood smoke and the sharp bite of dried yarrow. Shelves lined the walls with jars of roots and feathers, bundles of bones tied with faded ribbon. Granny Lavinia sat hunched by the hearth, gnarled hands busy with a length of twine she knotted and unknotted without looking. She fixed him with pale eyes filmed by age yet sharp enough to cut and told him to sit. When he hesitated, she reached under the table and drew out a small book bound in cracked leather, its pages warped and yellowed as old fatback. "This here belonged to my aunt, Mercy Pike," she said, voice low as wind through a keyhole. "Kept it hid till she passed in the winter of '89. Wrote in it steady from the time she could hold a pencil. Mostly remedies and birth records, but toward the back she set down things she heard on her rounds, things folks whispered when fever or pain loosened their tongues." She opened the diary with fingers that trembled only slightly and turned past pages dense with faded ink until she reached a section marked with a pressed sprig of mountain laurel gone brittle and brown. There, in Mercy's careful spidery hand, were accounts from the years around 1870 to 1880, names of young men who had courted girls from the deeper coves bearing the Voss surname or its older branches. Each entry brief, chilling in its sameness, a suitor taken sudden ill after bedding the girl, wasting away with dreams of voices and cold hands, found dead in the woods or vanished entire, leaving only boot prints that ended abrupt at some laurel thicket. Granny Lavinia traced one passage with a cracked nail. "Same blood," she murmured. "Same signs. Cool skin, eyes that don't reflect proper, whispers riding the dark. They marry in, then the man fades, and the woman moves on or stays barren but never alone." She closed the book and pushed it toward Elias, the leather warm from the fire as though it carried its own fever. "Read it yourself come nightfall," she said, but not aloud, and not where she can hear. "The mountains keep long memories, boy, and some debts pass down quieter than land or name." The new year came in bitter, with a wind that knifed down the chimneys and piled snow against the cabin door until Elias had to shovel a tunnel to reach the woodpile. Sleep had become a fractured thing, snatched in shallow bursts between the swell of voices that no longer waited for darkness. They followed him now into the grey half-light of dawn, threading through the creak of the floorboards and the low moan of the stove, always louder when Eleanor lay beside him, her breathing slow and even as creek ice. One night in early January, the whispers sharpened into something almost coherent. Elias woke suddenly, heart hammering, to find the room bathed in moonlight that poured through the single window like cold milk. Eleanor slept, or seemed to, her face turned toward him, lips parted just enough to show the gleam of teeth. The voices rose from every corner, overlapping in a chorus that tugged at him like hooks under the ribs. They spoke his name, drew it out until it frayed, then wove it into older names he did not know. The pull was physical, a pressure behind the eyes and in the soles of his feet, urging him up, out, toward the tree line where the forest pressed black against the snow. He resisted at first, clenching the quilt until his knuckles whitened, but the voices only grew sweeter, promising answers, promising rest. Eleanor stirred then, her hand sliding across his chest with that familiar coolness, fingers tracing idle circles that matched the rhythm of the murmurs. Her eyes opened, reflecting the moonlight in flat silver discs, and she whispered a single word, goat soft as a sigh yet heavy as verdict. The compulsion snapped tight. Elias rose without willing it, pulled on his boots and coat in movements that felt borrowed, and stepped into the night. The snow took his weight without sound, and the cold bit deep, but he felt none of it. The voices led him along a path he had never walked by day, winding between laurel thickets and stands of hemlock whose branches sagged under heavy white burdens. Moonlight filtered through in pale shafts, turning the snow to hammered tin. Shapes moved at the edge of sight, tall, thin figures that might have been trees or men long dead, their outlines blurring whenever he turned his head. Deeper in, the air grew thicker, scented with leaf mold and something coppersweet. The whispers parted like curtains, revealing glimpses. A young man with Elias's own face but older, worn, eyes wide in terror as pale hands reached from shadow. Another with throat bruised black, mouth open in a silent scream. Faces he almost recognized from Granny Lavenia's diary, mouths shaping pleas that dissolved into the wind. They reached for him, fingers trailing frost across his sleeves, and the voices promised he would join them soon, that the bride's hunger was ancient and patient, fed by generations of men who had lain with Voss women and heard the same sweet summons into the dark. The trees closed tighter, branches knitting overhead until the moonlight dwindled to thin blades, and the visions pressed closer, their cold breath mingling with his own. The thaw came sudden in late February, turning the snow to slush that sucked at boots and dripped from the eaves in a steady, maddening rhythm. Elias had not returned to the deep woods since that moonlit night, yet the visions clung to him like burrs, surfacing in daylight flashes that left him swaying on his feet. He avoided Eleanor's touch now, sleeping fitfully on a pallet by the hearth, but she watched him with the same unblinking patience, as though time meant little to her. One evening the wind shifted, carrying the smell of wet earth and something sharper, like blood left too long in a bowl. Elias sat whittling a stick he had no use for, the knife trembling in his grip, when Eleanor rose from her chair without a sound. She crossed the room and knelt before him, her dress pooling dark around her knees. In the firelight her face looked younger than he remembered, almost childlike, yet the eyes held centuries. She took the knife from his unresisting fingers and set it aside, then drew the leather pouch from her apron pocket and loosened the drawstring. The herbs spilled across the floorboards in a pattern he now recognized, circles within circles, lines radiating like roots. She began to speak, not in the soft voice he knew, but in a layered chorus that rose from her throat and from the walls and from the fire itself. The words were old, guttural, tasting of iron and pine pitch. As she spoke, the candle on the mantel flared though no draught stirred it, and the shadows lengthened until they touched the ceiling beams. Elias tried to stand, but his limbs felt bound by invisible cords. Eleanor reached for him, palms open, and where her fingers brushed his skin the cold sank deep, past muscle to marrow. The sigils she had once traced in charcoal now glowed faintly beneath her own flesh, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. She pressed closer, lips parting, and he saw then what he had refused to see, the faint translucence of her form where firelight passed through, the way her shadow lagged a breath behind her movements, as though it belonged to something larger wearing her shape. The voices surged, no longer whispers but a roaring approval that shook dust from the rafters. Eleanor's hands slid beneath his shirt, nails lengthening into curved talons that scored thin lines across his chest, drawing beads of blood that she caught on her fingertips and painted across her own lips. Pleasure and pain braided tight, dragging a sound from his throat that was half sob, half moan. She leaned in until her mouth hovered over his, breath tasting of grave soil and wild honey, and the chorus spoke through her, names of men long dead, promises of union eternal, hunger older than the mountains themselves. In that moment the veil tore wide. Elias saw her true nature layered beneath the borrowed beauty, an ancient thing rooted in the hollows, fed by generations of brides who lured and drained and passed the debt onward. The bedroom rituals had never been for pleasure alone, they were offerings, slow bleedings that bound the living to the waiting dark. Her eyes, fully open now, held no humanity, only vast and patient appetite, and the voices laughed with her mouth as she drew him down into the final, inescapable embrace. Elias tore free from the cabin with a strength born of raw terror, the door banging wide against the wall as he stumbled into the night. The slush soaked his boots instantly, cold seeping up his legs, but he ran blindly along the trace that led deeper into the forest, breath soaring in his throat. Behind him the chorus of voices rose in a howl of frustration or pursuit, he could no longer tell which, and Eleanor's layered cry threaded through them, calling his name in tones both pleading and commanding. The trees closed around him like a living fence, branches whipping his face until blood mingled with sweat and meltwater. Moonlight had waned to a thin rind, yet a faint luminescence seemed to rise from the ground itself, guiding or luring him onward. His feet found a path he had never known, narrow and switchbacking down a ravine where no trail had been marked on any hunter's memory. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of turned earth and old smoke, and the whispers shifted from pursuit to invitation, promising revelation if he would only keep going. At the bottom of the ravine the ground leveled into a small clearing no wider than a wagon bed, ringed by ancient hemlocks whose trunks rose straight and black as pillars. Snow had not settled here, instead the earth lay bare and dark, churned in places as though something large had rooted and wallowed. In the center stood a low mound of stones, moss-covered and sunken, arranged in the same spiraling pattern Eleanor scattered across the bedroom floor. Around it, half buried in leaf mold, lay fragments of older offerings, yellowed bone whistles, rusted blades, scraps of cloth stiff with ancient stains, and small leather pouches rotted open to spill their withered contents. Elias staggered to a halt, chest heaving, as the voices coalesced into a single presence that filled the clearing without echoing. Shapes moved between the trees, tall, thin silhouettes of men he now recognized from the moonlit visions and from Mercy Pike's diary entries. They stood motionless, faces pale and hollowed, eyes reflecting the faint ground glow like animals caught in lamplight. Their mouths opened in unison, and the revelation poured forth not in words but in understanding that settled cold and complete into his mind. Generations past, a woman of the Voss blood, starved by isolation and grief, had bargained here with something older than the mountains, something that wore hunger as a second skin. In exchange for continuance of her line, she offered the warmth of men who lay with her descendants, a slow tithe paid in nights of ritual union until the debt renewed itself with each new bride. The voices were those men, bound to witness and to draw the next offering deeper, their essence feeding the thing that rooted beneath the stones. Eleanor was only the latest vessel, beautiful and patient, carrying out the ancient compact with the same certainty she had shown on their wedding night. The ground trembled faintly, a pulse like a vast heart far below, and the silhouettes beckoned with hands that left trails of frost in the air. Elias felt the pull returning, stronger now in this sacred or profane place, promising that surrender would end the fear and grant him eternity among them, watching from the dark as the cycle turned again. The clearing pulsed with that subterranean heartbeat, steady and unhurried, as though the earth itself drew breath through the stone mound. Elias stood frozen at the edge, boots sinking into the dark soil, while the bound shades of former suitors ringed him closer, their frost-trailed hands outstretched in welcome or warning. The voices no longer pleaded or threatened, they simply stated, calm as creek water over stone, that the hour had come for the final sealing. From the ravine above, footsteps approached, light, deliberate, untroubled by mud or briar. Eleanor emerged between the hemlocks, her dress untouched by the thaw's filth, hair unbound and stirring though no wind moved the branches. Moonlight, thin as it was, seemed to gather around her until she glowed faintly, a lantern carried into fog. The sigils beneath her skin burned now with cold blue fire, visible through the fabric at throat and wrists, and her eyes held the vastness of underground rivers. She walked the spiral path between the stones without looking down, as though it had been worn by her feet across centuries. When she reached Elias she stopped an arm's length away, head tilted in that old listening posture, and the chorus fell silent, leaving only the wet drip of melting snow from the hemlocks and the slow thud beneath the ground. She raised her hands, palms up, and the leather pouch hung from her wrist by its worn drawstring, swaying gently. Elias felt the last of his resistance unravel, thread by thread. The cold that had lived in her touch now lived in him, spreading from the scored lines on his chest outward until his breath plumed white in the warming air. She stepped forward and placed her palms against his, fingers aligning perfectly, and the contact sealed something irrevocable. Pleasure returned, not as heat but as a vast, slow tide, drawing him down through layers of soil and memory into the root dark where the thing waited. Images flooded him, brides in older dresses standing in this same clearing, grooms with faces like his own offering themselves willingly or in terror, the exchange completed again and again so the line endured. He understood then that the disturbing practices in the bedroom had only been preparation, a gradual attuning of his blood to the hunger below. The whispers, the cool skin, the rituals with herb and bone and sigil, all threads woven to bind him here, now, for the true union. Eleanor leaned in until her forehead rested against his, and her breath carried the scent of deep earth after rain. The shades closed the circle tighter, their forms beginning to dissolve into streamers of pale mist that flowed toward the joined pair. The heartbeat quickened, matching the sudden thunder in Elias's ears, and he felt himself thinning, warmth and weight and will draining through their linked hands into the waiting dark. Her lips brushed his, not a kiss but an opening, and the final merging began, slow and exquisite and endless, as the ancient pact claimed its latest fulfillment beneath the indifferent stars.